Welcome. In this ultimate tutorial you will learn my thought process behind mixing, so you'll be able to mix a clean and powerful track like this. The example I use here is my upcoming track Tomb, just because it's perfect to demonstrate everything I wanna teach you here. Without further ado, I will show you layer by layer how I think about mixing and how I compose a mix to sound this full. Starting off with the main sound. Here is the main plug. It's really tonal. So it sounds super ugly, as you can hear. It's really just ugly clipping in solo, but it doesn't matter because in the full mix it sounds really good. And you don't hear this ugly clipping at all because of the other layers and how it's all working together. So my first advice would be to never really mix in solo unless you really have to. Like for example, trying to get rid of one specific resonance in your bass shot or something, then mixing in solo can be actually really helpful. But overall, mixing in solo can really just make more problems than it takes away. So for me, it doesn't work at all. I try to mix in the whole mix as much as I possibly can. So yeah, coming back to this main sound, without any processing, it sounds like this. Oh yeah, and without this. It's a really simple sound. Like a really simple sound, and it was made from a foghorn sound, actually, from my other song, It's a Feeling. It's also out now. You can check this out. It's a DnB track. A lot of people like it. So yeah, feel free to check it out. The sound is basically two sine waves with a seventh, I mean the fifth, because 7 is a fifth. I don't know why you musicians have to be so complicated. It's a sub sine played with a short envelope. We are adding this sine wave on +7 and both taking the AM from it and playing this actual oscillator. And what I have noticed about playing the actual B oscillator, it's making a really gritty and pleasant texture on the sound, because without this oscillator playing, it sounds weird, really just weird and like goofy. With this, it has that really wobbly and gritty but soft texture. Later on, I'm adding this filter, a little bit of saturation on high drive and a really low mix, just to add those higher harmonics that I will turn back up with processing. Then I'm using this plugin called Harmonic Adder. It's free, it's really crazy, you can get super creative with this. I love it for adding more harmonics and just interest to the sound. And it sounds so cool with all the artifacts it's making. Like it's like little smearing of the sound. It's not like so plucky now. Later on, I'm using this Saturn. If I would like to choose my favorite distortion plugin, I would say it's Saturn, just because it has a really cool character. Later on, I'm just putting an EQ, then driving it really hard to make it super gritty. And what I'm trying to do with this processing is to just establish this main sound. I often start with creating main bass as cool as I can. Later on the mix, I may possibly just thin it up to not make the mix so overblown. Yeah, most of the times I'm just beefing up the initial main sound, the main theme of the drop, until it sounds good, and I'm building around of this to keep it sounding as good as possible and just add other elements that will work together with this sound. And yeah, I think that order in which you are making your music and your sounds is really important and can change a lot, can help you a ton with workflow. Because for example, you can start with using an EQ on a head, which doesn't make much sense, and spend a lot of time. This is just a stupid example, but you get what I'm talking about. After this saturation, I'm using a decapitator on T mode, which is a biased saturation, and I want to record another tutorial on this for you guys, just to show you how cool asymmetric saturation could be. It adds a lot of character, but you need to be careful with it, so this is why I am going to record a tutorial on this. After all this saturation, it started to sound pretty ugly in the high end. Like really raw. It could be cool, but not with the idea I had in my head. So I'm putting a 100% wet reverb, Valhalla vintage verb. On the settings you can see, so really low decay, really low size, and what it's doing, it's basically processing the signal like crazy. You know, reverb works with delaying and modulating a lot of delays on your sound, and it makes it more noisy, organic, interesting, and also it can create a cool sounding stereo field. As you can hear, it's really wide and it's really soft and interesting in timbre. Later on, I'm using Soothe and dipping the frequencies at around 250 Hz, just because these frequencies are really like, you need to be super careful with these and to keep this area clean, both with your sub actually. The area where you want your mix to be like the most scientific is your sub for sure, and then also I would say up to 300 Hz. If you have a lot of noise and like uncontrolled sounds going up there, or even have this area of your mix clean but loud, it can make it sound muddy and not have that super punchy energy. It will also take out of your sub. Another thing I want to mention with this is how to make your sub feel more deep. It's just to isolate it and make as much room as you possibly can make, because when the area around the frequency is clean and you don't have a lot of frequencies around that, for example fundamental frequency, it seems louder, more powerful, because it's more stable. And more importantly, it's because ears are working like this. Let's say you would have a lot of noise around this frequency. This frequency will start to shake a bit in amplitude, because the noise underneath this would make it more chaotic. Cancel it out and then boost it up. And that's why if you want to make a certain frequency stand out, you really need to clean the area around this frequency. And you pretty much want your sub to stand out in this type of tracks, I feel, and redeem in dubstep. Okay, so another effect I have on this main bass is a mid-side EQ, where I'm basically cutting up unnecessary low end and also high end on the mids, and I'm doing the same thing but just way more with sides. So I'm cutting up sides from mid-range because it sounded like it wasn't focused. Also a big thing that my friend Return figured it out, cutting the stereo in your high end can make it sound way more focused and clean. Like this sounds, without this cut, it sounds a little bit like it is behind you, and I feel like you don't want this to happen with your main sound. It's really nice to have your main sounds just in front of the mix, and then a lot of stuff like effects and shakers, all that stuff more behind of you. Surely you can make your main sound be behind of the listener. That's like no problem with this if it's an artistic decision and it works, but it wasn't working here. I'm using Disperser just to give it a more lasery texture and also clean up the transient. This is the useful thing about Disperser. It just delays the lower frequencies, so the higher ones play first, and then when you push the sound really hard, it means that on the initial part of the sound, on the transient, you have only your high end and then it goes to the mid-range. So everything has more space. It prevents situations like your sound plays the whole spectrum at once, so no frequency can stand out. And with Disperser, you have your high end really high in the mix, and then it goes to the mids and then to the lows, and everything has its own space and time, which is a really cool thing. And this is why Disperser can make your drums sound cool, but it can also make it sound like gummy shit. Next thing on the main sound is a reduce ambience preset from multiband compressor in Ableton, and it is just a multiband gate. Pretty much. You can see or hear You probably need headphones to hear the difference, but it is just cutting all the unnecessary little reverb tail that will clutter the whole mix, because in the whole mix you need to think about this all the time. You have a lot of sounds probably, a lot of background, a lot of huts, rides, crashes, other layers. With all that stuff you need to really control your main sound to not take up too much space. Obviously, if you cut too much of the original main sound, it will lose its coolness and power. So you need to be also careful with this. And how I'm doing this, I'm setting every little parameter in the whole mix. When I'm mixing, I will just play the track, then set the threshold of the reduce ambience. Pretty much it applies to the every knob I'm touching. If I go a little too far, I'm just backing it up a little until it sounds perfectly cool and clean. Basically, we are optimizing every sound to take as little space as possible in terms of the dynamics, the headroom, the space, length, everything. You need to just minimize and optimize every sound, cut unwanted frequencies, cut unwanted parts, all that kind of stuff. Later on, I'm doing a really similar thing with Soothe, but for the second time, I'm just controlling these muddy frequencies I talked about before with a really small sharpness. Because as I told you before, it makes frequencies stand out more, and most of the times you want your mids to be more clean and to have more space between every harmonic than in the high end, so we can have more noise and layers in the high end. But I'm always trying to keep my mids rather clean and harmonic, so this is why I'm using a low sharpness to make the Soothe cut up and control the area around the frequency. You know what I'm talking about, and not these frequencies alone. This will make it more noisy. You probably don't want your mids to be noisy. Later on, I'm using a really cool VST. It's called Punctuate. It is just a multi-band, a very multi-band transient shaper. It has 26 bands. I'm not using it as a multi-band transient shaper. As you can see, the adaptive transient is set to single band, so it is acting and it is boosting the volume of the whole signal, because when using multi-band it can sound really watery when all the bands are independent and can... I didn't want that, but I kept the 26 bands of this to keep the detection precise, because it detects the transients really well when it has all these bands to work with. I often like to boost my transients drastically and then clip it. Later on, I'm using a really smooth EQ. I tend to use more smoother shapes, especially on the main sounds, to again keep it more clean, keep it more harmonic, and not just kill the sound. There's a really stupid thing. I think it's not clever to do this stuff, especially in the days Soothe and other plugins like this is, I will show you. Looking for specific frequency and then dipping it down and then looking for another frequency and then sweeping this way, right? And then taking it out, right? And repeating the process, and your EQ looks like this. And what you are actually doing is killing your sound and making it sound really dead. So I'm not a big fan of this. Later on, as you can see, I'm using not that extreme, but kinda hard free clip. It's a really cool clipping VST. It's showing you the waveform. You can see it down here. It clips the signal digitally without any like character. Later on, I'm using Saturate, also from Newfangled Audio. This video is not sponsored. Like, I swear, I'm just using this VST often. Hey yo, what's up? I hope you enjoyed this video so far. I wanna let you know that the full 30 minutes tutorial is available on my Patreon down in the description. See you soon and have a great day.